Hello! So 2 weeks ago, I got a bunch of my friends to read The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett in our book club. Tainted Cup is probably the most critically acclaimed fantasy novel since Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, winning both the Hugo and the World Fantasy Award, a feat that hasn't been replicated in 21 years since Susanna Clarke's own Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I can understand why The Tainted Cup made such a splash. It pitches itself as a full synthesis of the mystery and fantasy genres, with an eccentric middle-aged woman standing in for Holmes and a young, magically empowered, dyslexic everyman standing in for Watson. It's been breathlessly praised all over the internet as well as all over the physical realm for how innovative it is, both in terms of its genre-blending flavor as well as the Lovecraftian, Shingeki no Kyojin-esque world that it takes place in. My friends generally had a pretty good time with this book, and I viscerally disliked it. In fact, I would say this is the single worst book I have read in 2026. I have a litany of complaints about every single aspect of this novel: the prose, the dialogue, the characterization, and even the much vaunted world building. But because it is statistically likely that you, the viewer, are a big fan of this book, I am not going to make this into a big dunk session, so I will just focus on one of my primary complaints, one that is shared by many people who do love the book. It's not that good of a mystery. Sure, it appropriates a lot of the aesthetics of an early 20th century mystery novel, such as the manor and the locked room mystery and the waitstaff who you don't know if they are complicit in these murders or not. You can tell that at the end of the day, this is written by a fantasy writer who is trying to do a mystery rather than the reverse. It's not paced like one of those tight 150-page Agatha Christie novels. It's paced like an epic fantasy novel. So I found it a huge slog, and I did not find the mystery all too compelling. When the solution is ultimately revealed, it made me so furious how obvious and dull it was. Honestly, something I was guessing at by like chapter 3, that I wanted to throw this book across the room. I didn't, because A, I was in a public coffee shop, and B, because this is a library book, and I'm not a monster who mistreats library books. So even though I didn't have the best experience with The Tainted Cup, it gave me the impetus to finally check out a volume that I had thrifted a couple of years ago, and that would be the LORD Darcy trilogy by Randall Garrett, which not only is a fantasy take on Holmes and Watson just like The Tainted Cup, but one that was nominated for the Hugo 59 years ago. The first fantasy novel to ever be nominated for a Hugo. That realization made all the claims about The Tainted Cup being the first to blend fantasy and Sherlockian mystery all the more frustrating to me. Am I really the first person to go back and check to see if there are other fantasy mysteries nominated for the Hugo? But I'll stop complaining about The Tainted Cup for now. If you like it, that's fine. But I highly encourage you to additionally check out this series. I think it's much better at presenting tight, locked room mysteries that just happen to have fantasy elements rather than the inverse. So I've been showing you the 3-in-1 volume that was published in the late 80s, but as I was reading this series, I actually discovered the individual volumes for $1 a piece. So I went ahead and purchased those because I prefer reading things in mass market paperback. And that would be Murder and Magic, which is a set of 4 short stories, Too Many Magicians, which is a full-length novel. This is what was nominated for the Hugo in 1967. And finally, Lord Darcy Investigates, which is 4 more short stories. There are 2 short stories that Randall Garrett wrote in this universe that never got collected in this initial run of paperbacks, but if you buy a modern omnibus edition, those will be collected. But since I don't have that omnibus, I did not read those 2 stories. I'm about to launch into the pitch for a moment, but I want to quickly disclaim my claim claim that Too Many Magicians is the first ever fantasy novel nominated for Hugo, just so that people don't nitpick me in the comments. There are a couple of science fiction novels with fantasy elements that did get nominated before this, most notably Glory Road by Heinlein, as well as Witch World by Andre Norton. In the same year that this got nominated, we actually had a second fantasy nomination, Day of the Minotaur by Thomas Burnett Swan. I like Day of the Minotaur way more in premise than I do execution. This is the same year that Flowers for Algernon got nominated, as well as Babel 17 by Samuel R. Delany. Very, very strong year. Heinlein won it. Oh well. After this year, 1967, we do not see a full-stop fantasy novel nominated for almost 15 years. Not until Harpist in the Wind by Patricia McKillop in 1980. This is an excellent fantasy novel. I just finished it a couple weeks ago, but it definitely seems out of place considering how sci-fi heavy the Hugos were in the 70s. But it seems like Harpist in the Wind widened the gap a little bit to allow certain fantasy novels in if the voting body of the Hugos felt like it was worthy of acclaim, such as John Crowley's masterpiece Little Big. But why was Too Many Magicians nominated for the Hugo for Best Novel in a 30-year span when the Hugos weren't nominating anything else that was fantastic? Well, that's actually pretty easy to explain, because Too Many Magicians is a fantasy novel, but it is an alternate history fantasy novel. It is set in our world, but in a different timeline. And traditionally, alt history was considered a branch of science fiction. I don't think the taxonomy is as strict these days. Now you can just say like alternate history is speculative fiction. Really allows you to be a lot more flexible in categorizing these novels, because until then you had all these edge cases like Too Many Magicians or Ash's Secret History. They are being looked at by science fiction communities, but they almost exclusively contain fantasy elements. The Lord Darcy series, written by Randall Garrett, takes place in a world where the Angevin Empire never fell. In case you're not familiar with the term, the Angevin Empire is what modern historians refer to the vast land holdings of English King Henry II and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their union of all of these different holdings in France and the British Isles threatened to become one of the major European powers in the High Middle Ages. However, thanks to the somewhat early death of Richard I, aka Richard the Lionhearted, as well as the incompetent frittering away of the lands by his brother King John, the English kings lost nearly all of their holdings in France and became desperate to reclaim it for hundreds of years afterwards, leading to the 100 Years' War and other conflicts. You know, there's actually a booktuber who made a pretty good video about the history of the Angevin Empire and how it impacted early fantasy literature. What was his name? Oh wait, it was me. I did it. I made a video about the Angevin Empire 2 months ago. You can watch it right now. So honestly, when I picked these books up, I had no idea that they were set in a world where Richard I didn't die young and instead was able to consolidate his land and leave it to his nephew, leading to an Anglo-French empire that lasted for 800 years. This timeline also has one other major difference, which is in the 1400s, the Angevin Empire discovered magic. But not just any magic, codified logical magic that obeyed strict rules and theories. Magic is something that you can study as a discipline, but you can't practice it unless you have a natural gift for it. Because the disciplined use of magic ends up becoming the backbone of this world's technological progress, the Industrial Revolution never happens. These stories, which are written throughout the 1960s and 70s, take place in the modern day, the 1960s and 70s. But due to this lack of industrial revolution, they're kind of on a technological and cultural level equivalent to the Victorian period. Our protagonist is Lord Darcy. He is very unsubtly the Sherlock Holmes analog. He is the chief chief investigator for Duke Richard of Normandy, brother to the king. He goes around the empire and solves mysteries, which often seem like they are caused by magic. Lord Darcy is a very intelligent and well-learned man, but he cannot use magic. He just simply does not have the gift for it, but that is why he has his Watson, the portly Irish sorcerer, Master Sean O'Loughlin. You can see the two of them on this cover here. Sean assists Lord Darcy in his investigations. He is not as good as an investigator, but he is one of the best sorcerers on the planet. And that leads to two things that I absolutely love about this series. One is the strong mutual respect between Lord Darcy and Master Sean. I think one of the biggest adaptive mistakes that many Sherlockian adaptations make is treating Watson like he's a huge dumbass. He becomes a bumbling idiot. I don't know, Sherlock. What's the answer to the mystery? And Sherlock has to be like, oh, you twit. It's actually this. Elementary. What makes Watson such a great character, in my opinion, is that he is very smart. He is an accomplished surgeon. He is an accomplished doctor. He's just not smart in the same ways that Sherlock is smart. So even if he isn't able to solve the mysteries themselves, he is at least able to follow Holmes's logic after the fact, right? In these Lord Darcy stories, Lord Darcy says, I could not solve these mysteries without Sean. He respects him so much and he cares for him so much. The premise of Too Many Magicians, the only novel-length story in this series, is that Sean is falsely accused of murder at a magician's conference. And of course, Lord Darcy will do anything to save his best friend. The next thing that made me fall in love with these stories is the way that magic gets deployed. While a lot of the murders in this series seem like they are being executed with magic, I think basically every single one of them ends up being mundane, because that is in accordance to the laws of fair play mystery. If some magician just ended up blowing up somebody's head from hundreds of miles away, that wouldn't be a satisfying solution to a mystery. Because Sean is so knowledgeable about the theory and logic of magic, he is able to help Lord Darcy cross out various magical explanations. Here's an example from Too Many Magicians, where the body of a powerful magician is found in a locked room high up in a hotel. So Lord Darcy wants to ask Sean, what is the possibility someone killed this magician and then just flew out the window? Very well, said Lord Darcy with a smile. Let us proceed to try that theory by what the geometers call, I believe, the reductio ad absurdum. Imagine the scene. What happens? He gestured toward the body on the floor. Sir James is stabbed. Our sorcerer-murderer, if you'll pardon the double entendre, goes to the window. He opens it, and he steps up to the sill and steps into empty air, levitating himself as he does so. Then he closes the window and proceeds to cast a spell which slides the bolts into the sockets. When that is done, he floats off somewhere, up or down and matters not which. He looked at Master Sean. How long would that take? 5 or 6 minutes at the least. If he could do it at all. Levitation causes a tremendous psychic drain. The spell can only be held for a matter of minutes. In addition, you're asking him to cast a second spell while he's holding the first. A spell of the type that was cast on the room is what we call a static spell, my lord. It imposes a condition, you see. But levitating and moving the bolts are kinetic spells. You have to keep them moving. To use 2 kinetic spells at the same time requires tremendous concentration, power, and precision. I would hesitate myself to try casting a window locking spell with a 30-foot drop beneath me. Certainly not if I were in a hurry or distracted. In addition, they make it very clear in the series that you can't just cast a spell to find out who did a crime. But you can use magic to discover various things about the crime scenes in a manner akin to modern forensic science. And one of the real joys of the series is figuring out how these magicians have replicated various technologies through magic. Sean can use the causal relationship between a fired bullet and a gun to discover that it was shot at like 11:37 p.m., right? One of my favorite moments in one of the early stories is how he's talking about how magicians can use a special spell to determine paternity. They are able to evaluate samples of blood against each other on a scale from 0 to 46. And the higher that scale is, the more likely it is that two people are related. Oh, wow. What they're doing is comparing chromosome pairs in the blood, right? 0 to 46, 23 pairs. And I was like, oh, that's absolutely genius. Every single story in this series is more or less standalone. Darcy and Sean are, for better or for worse, static characters. They do not grow or change from story to story, but neither did Hercule Poirot. But with each story, you get tiny little drips of world building, discovering more and more about how this world progressed differently than our own. And I found those little drips absolutely delicious. You never get more than a paragraph of exposition at a time. These are tight mystery adventures first and foremost, fantasy novels second, and I respect it for that. However, there are ongoing themes and concerns, the main one being about this Cold War analog against the Empire of Poland, which ends up being the major Eastern European power bloc. While it's established that Poland in this world is weaker than the Angevin Empire, if they were to be attacked directly, then a lot of the unaligned buffer states might swing towards Poland and shift the balance of power. The primary concern of this series is that there are various Polish spies and double agents who are trying to infiltrate His Majesty's Navy and steal a new magical technology or steal a new cipher or all of these different things, right? And in the final book of the series, you get more and more explicit political machinations. I think if you read all of these books in a row, like I did, you might get a little burned out because all of the stories are sort of like, Darcy and Sean have to solve a locked room murder, get a little bit of world building, you get a little bit of political development, but like ultimately the status quo is mostly restored. So if you're to read these books, I kind of recommend drip feeding them, reading a story or two in between other things that you're reading just to get the full appreciation for how cleverly Randall Garrett writes all of these books. I could easily have read 10 of these because they are just so fun, they are so addicting, but that was not meant to be. Before I get into why this series ended up finishing prematurely, let me talk a little bit about Randall Garrett himself. Randall Garrett wrote a litany of sci-fi short stories throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He was a mentor to Robert Silverberg. He actually co-authored some of Silverberg's earliest work, and he helped encourage Silverberg to becoming one of the most prolific writers of sci-fi and fantasy to ever live. Garrett was this well-educated man, one who loved including subtle references and wordplay in all of his works. I know these Lord Darcy books have a ton of hidden references to early 20th century mystery. Not just Holmes and Watson or to Agatha Christie, but also like Nero Wolfe and a lot of these other classic detectives. At a lot of these early science fiction conventions, Randall Garrett was often the life of the party, though that leads to what I would say is his major character flaw, which I can't let go unaddressed. He would aggressively flirt with basically every single woman he ever came across, ever. And by aggressively flirt, I mean sexually harass, right? Which must have been deeply uncomfortable if you were one of the few women who were attending these early science fiction conventions, people like Andre Norton or Anne McCaffrey or what have you. But he wouldn't even be catcalling people. You wouldn't stop sexually harassing women with puns. I can't even imagine how unbearable that must have been. I fortunately found the representation in these Lord Darcy books to be pretty even-handed, at least as even-handed as you can expect a Holmes and Watson story to be. So like still mostly men. Before we leave the uncomfortable topic of Randall Garrett and his relationship to women, we have to address the beehive in the room, which is in 1958, early on in his career, he wrote a short story called The Queen Bee, which is widely regarded as the most sexist short story in the entire history of science fiction. Do you know how high a bar that is? It's basically about a group of colonists who crash land on a planet, and then the men are like, we have crash landed, but we are going to form a new civilization. We're gonna get all these women to be the breeding mothers of our new society, whether they want to or not. Ha 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 ha. We're men. Ha 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 ha. While the existence of that story is obviously deeply regrettable, it did lead to something good. A couple of years later, our lesbian queen of science fiction, Joanna Russ, read that story. Would you guess it? She was pissed. It made her crash out. And in response, she angrily wrote her own take on that premise, a novel entitled We Who Are About To. And let me tell you, We Who Are About To ... is one of the best sci-fi novels ever written. So powerful, it is so angry, cynical, hard-hitting, and the prose is just, it's just immaculate. Almost Virginia Woolf levels of stream of consciousness writing. Highly recommend reading that novel. One of the darkest novels ever written. It will ruin your entire week. It is so worth the ride, at least in my opinion. In 1979, Randall Garrett wrote the 10th and final Lord Darcy story. Shortly afterwards, he got some sort of viral infection. The infection got in his brain or his spinal fluid or maybe both. He didn't die, but he was left in a state of permanent and severe amnesia, unable to recognize himself or anybody else. His wife, Vicky Ann Hadron, tried to take care of him at their home, but after a few years, she realized she couldn't maintain his care. So she had him placed in a hospital under assisted care for the rest of his life. In the meantime, she wrote a full fantasy epic, The Gondolara Cycle, under Randall Garrett's name to pay for their bills. I think Randall Garrett had the initial idea for the series, which is this John Carter riff, a guy going to an alien planet and getting his own He-Man style psychic battle cat. But even though the books are often credited to the both of them, it is pretty clearly her who did 98% of the work. Randall Garrett ended up passing away in 1987. Immediately afterwards, his friend Michael Kurland ended up writing 2 more Lord Darcy books, which I would really like to read if I had the chance to. 10 Little Wizards and A Study in Sorcery. What is Wizards pawning off of? I should ask Howard Phillips. Michael Kurland is most famous for writing a bunch of novels from the point of view of Sherlock Holmes's biggest enemy, Professor Moriarty. So he was a right fit to write more Lord Darcy books. Not only that, but Michael Kurland also wrote a novel in 1968 called The Unicorn Kid, which is about he himself, like literally Michael Kurland and his author friends traveling to different parallel worlds, one of which is the Lord Darcy universe, perhaps thanks to the influence of the Lord Darcy novels. Throughout the 70s and 80s, you had a proliferation of fantasy mystery novels, though unlike Lord Darcy, many of them were more explicitly hard-boiled as opposed to the Holmes and Watson feel. For example, Mike Resnick's Stalking the Unicorn, A Fable of Tonight, which was published the year Randall Garrett died. Or the most obvious example, Glenn Cook is most known for The Black Company, his influential series of proto-grimdark fantasy novels, but his longest running series is a noir fantasy mystery, Garrett P.I., being named after Randall Garrett. And from there, noir fantasy has proliferated into the wider genre of urban fantasy. And now the likes of the Dresden Files are one of the longest running stunning and most popular series in the entire genre. So here we've come full circle. Over 60 years after Randall Garrett started writing these short stories, Sherlockian fantasy is all the rage. Even though I wasn't crazy about the Tainted Cup, I am very excited about the proliferation of Sherlockian fantasy, or really any other form of genre blending fantasy. If you love mysteries, if you love weird timelines, if you just love good stinking prose, I highly recommend that you read these books. The Sidewise Award, which is the most prestigious award for alternate history fiction, went out of their way to give a special achievement award to this series decades after the fact, just because of how beautiful and influential they are. I was able to thrift these pretty easily, but fortunately, unlike most of the stuff I recommend, this is in print. Like, you can go on the internet and you can get an ebook. You can buy a brand new copy today. So go do it, dang it! Buy a copy now. If you had to choose one, I guess probably just read Too Many Magicians, since that's the most sumptuous narrative. I am running late for a bachelor party at Buffalo Wild Wings, so I gotta go. Anyway, yeah, thank you. Pew, 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 pew. See you around, buddy.